Hi, my name's David Vizard, and you are watching PowerTec 10. Give me a few minutes of your time, and I will give you the benefit of my over 50 years of race-winning engine building. Today's topic is heads for supercharged engines. Now let me dispel a myth here. I've heard it said that cylinder heads aren't important on a supercharged engine because the supercharger forces the air into the engine. Well, yes it does, but to generate that force causes inefficiencies. We need the air to flow in as easy as possible, but the heads that we're going to use for optimum performance on a blower motor, and for that matter on a nitrous motor, are not the same as we would use for a normally aspirated engine. So let's delve into that. Firstly, let's delve into the flow characteristics of cylinder heads for a normally aspirated engine. One of the maybe most important is not a good phrase to use, but an important factor here, especially if you're looking for the last ounce of power out of the engine, such as a NASCAR motor or a Pro Stock motor, the ratio of the flow of the intake and exhaust is important. Now this ratio is not fixed, although the number 0.75 crops up very often, and that is the exhaust needs to flow 75% of the intake. These flow ratios, or this flow ratio, generally only applies when the full area of the cylinder is utilized by the valves. In other words, the distance across the valves closely approaches the bore size. The question is, how should we apportion the sizes of the valves? Should we be biased towards the intake, exhaust, or what? Well, as I've said, a normally aspirated engine is usually, if it's about 11-to-1 engine, about 75%. This ratio, however, hinges very largely on the compression ratio, or more importantly, the expansion ratio, which is the flip side of the coin of compression ratio. Well, I have a head over here which I can use to explain what I'm talking about, and it's to do with these valve sizes here. This is a head specifically for supercharger use, and we'll look at the differences that we need to accommodate. The first thing that we did was put in beryllium exhaust valves here, valve seats, right? You can probably see that they are a little different color to the normal seats. Secondly, whilst putting in the valve seats, we enlarged the valve seats to a 1.72 diameter. The stock valve on these heads, intake valve, comes at a 194. So there was room to put in this larger valve. So instead of the normal 202/16 or 205/16, right, what we had was a 194 and a 172. So you can see we've sacrificed some intake valve size for exhaust valve size. Here's how the intake and exhaust valves look when installed. As you can see, it doesn't look that much different to stock. It's not until you put a virtually stock-sized valve head up against it that you can see the difference. Oh, by the way, this is a dart casting here, and you'll be happy to know that this particular Ford dart casting works very well. It has gone through life in two forms. Firstly, it was used just to test, some tests I did for dart, and showed up very well. And then we used this head to develop a supercharger head for somebody who unfortunately has passed on. So it's surplus to requirements right now. So we'll have these heads for sale after we've done this video. Let's address the need for these valve size changes in a little more detail. Let me say first that they are applicable to supercharged engines, both in positive displacement or vane displacement or turbocharger form, and they're applicable to nitrous engines. The reason why we need to address these valve ratios is probably going to appear fairly obvious to most of you. What we're doing is we are pouring in or pushing in more oxidant, i.e. either the oxygen contained in the nitrous or the extra oxygen from the air from the supercharger boost. Let me make a point here, right? There's a lot of people have a fixation on the fact that they may make a mod and the boost drops. Now, boost is not the be-all and end-all of making power. What we're trying to do with our supercharger is get more air to go through the engine. A good friend of mine, the late Jerry Magnuson, and I'm a little quiet there because I knew the guy for over 45 years and he's been gone a couple of years now. He's still very much missed in my life. But Jerry Magnuson is renowned as being one of the great supercharger designers of the 20th century. He's the one that was responsible for the design work of the Magnuson supercharger, which, with Jerry's aid, a version was used on Pontiac, Mercedes, and a few other well-known brands. And he once said to me that people get fixated on this blower boost and they don't realize that they can get the most boost by welding the intake valve closed. That should demonstrate there the point. We're not trying to get boost, we're trying to get through flow of air. Of course, we will need boost to do that, but back to my point, let's not get fixated on boost. At the ultimate, or at the end of the day, it's how much horsepower we've got at the driving wheels that counts. Okay, let's put into practice what we've discussed so far. I'm going to use an example head here, and we are going to area rule the exhaust primarily, and we're going to apply a very similar technique but with a few changes to the intake. So let's have at it. Probably the best first step here is to grind an exhaust valve seat protector with the same underhead form as is going to be used. I've just back cut this and the seat to suit. Take a look at this face here. You'll note it's been faced off so that there's no margin there and that the OD of the valve is just a few thousandths less than the seat. This is critical for us to be able to get in with the grinder or the cutter and form the edge that comes out. We're going to do an area test. Let's just see how this all turns out. Let's just set that there so that that's the amount of area there is between the seats where there's no shrouding. Right, that won't go in there, nor will it come out. So the valve is shrouded. We need to fix that by cutting the chamber away so that when this valve is lifted by that much between the seats, there is a consistent area right through there. So that's what we'll do next. By the way, I usually start off with a smaller ball here to get the best form around the side of the valve here where it's shrouded. We can afford to undercut this a bit here to give us a little extra in terms of flow in the critical region. I call this area ruling the exhaust seat and valve. That's not a name that I've thought up. I've borrowed it from the aircraft industry. So that's what we'll do for our first move, is area rule the seat area. A point here that I didn't mention was the extent with which we need to use that flow ball technique on the exhaust. For what we're doing, typically the flow is supersonic up to around about 200 lift on your typical V8. Maybe a little bit more, but if we accommodate the first 200 thousandths, we are definitely in the ballpark. Now it's going to be noisy doing some of these tasks here, so I'm going to start off by giving you an idea of our baseline, but then it's going to be all downdraft, vacuum cleaners, suction noise, etc. So look for the text posted on top of the video. Anyway, here we go. First off, I'm going to use this 3/16 ball here, right? Lift the valve so that there's 3/16 of an inch between the seats, right? Now you'll see that it won't go in anywhere here. So all of this area at this lift is shrouding the valve. Now this is a critical part here because this is where we're going to have that high-speed gas. So the first thing we have to do is to clearance this chamber to this ball. I'm going to use this chamber, which has got the seat protector valve in it, as the test one, and then we'll go back and forward and see which one or how this changes, a modified one versus a stock one. So let's hit the trail on that. Now it's time to step up to the next size ball. This is as big as we will go. This one here is approximately 280 thousandths diameter, and that's as far as we'll go. The reason we're not going to go any bigger than that is that when the flow drops down to a speed below supersonic, it needs to be able to get around that corner there, and the area is not so important as the flow efficiency. If we cut above, see this line I've made here? If we cut much above that line, we will increase the flow on this side of the port at the expense of that side. That will cost us power. So we should not deshroud this any more than is necessary to take care of the supersonic flow in the early phases of the exhaust stroke. If you look closely, you'll see a line there. We're going to use the same technique with this ball, other than the fact that rather than try and pull it out from under here, we're going to try and push it in. And what we do with that is we make a line in the blue like this. And the reason we're going to do that is it's very easy to take too much off down here, right? So that's why we tackle it from this side. So our first move is to grind along here and I blued it up so that you can see what will be left from the original cut. In this shot here, you can see the blue area here, which is what I left from using the small ball to clearance under there. The big ball resulted in a shape like this, and to note, we tackled it from the other side, right? You'll see that that goes in just over halfway. That's where we want to be. Now the next job is to blend all this out with a emery disc. So that's what we'll do next. The intake we do in a similar fashion to the exhaust, but there are a few differences. What you see here are 3 flow balls. The small one is a 1/4, 5/16, 3/8. Now, the seat conditions for this are different to normal. The flow does not really go supersonic, although it approaches it. So what we're going to do is we are going to clear the shrouding completely, or at least as far as we can, with the 1/4 inch ball. Then we're going to use the 3/8 ball to lift the valve and clear it with the 1/4 one. This should leave us a chamber which has about an 80% factor of deshrouding, which for an intake is about where we want it. The reason for that is that the intake is more flow coefficient sensitive, not area, and having the walls closer but not too close can cause the flow to cling to them. So that's what we're going to do. Once we've set the height of the valve with the ball, it's a question of marking the chamber. In this shot, you can see the line in the chamber where the ball contacts both the edge of the valve and the chamber wall. This is where we have to cut up to. Here you see the chamber cut to the line, and so from here we can move on to our next step. The next move is to raise the valve to a slightly higher level than the ball we're going to use. You'll see here I've raised the valve about with a 1/2 inch ball, and I'm pulling through about a 3/8 ball. So that's all clear. So now we can move on to our next phase, which is to make sure we get the area right adjacent to the spark plug. Here is what we see after reforming for the 5/16 ball. Now, it's not quite just a 5/16 ball clearance here. This area is, right, but as it gets over here, it starts to form a trough, right? The air does not come in like this. It comes in at an angle, right? That does 2 things. 1, it increases the flow, and 2, it increases the swirl. Our next move, as far as the chambers are concerned, is to round this edge here, just this one. And that's to let the gases come back in to the quench area as the piston goes down. But also it's to soften the quench action going that way, as the swirl is this way, so we don't want to counteract it too much. Also, I should point out that with these chambers you need to run a tight quench clearance, something in the order of 28 to 30 thousandths. Right, make sure you've got everything right for that, because 28 is getting close to the point where they will hit. I'm going to blue this area up here so that you can see what's going on. So that's the next move. This is how it looks when I've cuttered it away. All that needs to be done now is to go over that with an emery roll and blend the chamber smoothly via this radius into here. Should only be left with a little bit of quench just here. Well, this is what we have when it's done. Notice I've followed the gasket line around here. You can see the continuation of it. And this here is rolling over. The angle between this and this is only about 20 degrees. So the intake valve is kind of well away from any quench that may go over that way. Right? It's more likely to go over this way, which is the way we want it. The swirl's going to be this way. The last part of the chamber we've got to do will be, let me just move the camera, will be this side here. This is very important, especially in a blower motor, right? And I'll explain the form of that when I turn the head over the other way so I can access it easier. Well, here we can see this cut back from the valve seat finished. The key to it is that it rolls over into the valve seat. It's not flat. As it comes away from the valve seat, it levels out and blends into this here. That is very good for promoting flow right at the last moment of the exhaust valve's lift when the quench action is taking place. That's one of the reasons why you need to have tight quench action on this face here. What that does is it gets rid of more exhaust and consequently gets a cleaner charge in, which is cooler, which will run more compression before it detonates. This is a cut through the exhaust seat. Here's that flat part that adjoins the quench pad over here, right? Now the point is this, a radius into the seat there, right? It gets rid of the last of the exhaust in the chamber much better. Also note here we've done the ball clearance here, but as it comes up here it's less and less. So we don't want air or gases coming round this corner here, not being able to make it round here and shutting off this side of the port. Again, an orientation, roof of the port, floor. Don't remove any metal that you can avoid doing on the floor. When this actually matches up to a gasket, we'll put the number across the top of the screen. Is one of those few occasions when a gasket match actually is beneficial, right? So we match the gasket up here. We widen the port here, consistent with not breaking into the pushrod hole. We don't take any more metal off here than we have to other than to blend it. This corner here is a high flow corner. You need to move the floor up a bit so that it at least goes straight in and make this a nice blending radius in this turn here. And there will be a bowl in this area here. Now hopefully you can see that with the screwdriver just in there. This area here is a bowl, right? So the flow comes out at an angle like that. Now if you look very carefully, you can just see the exit vein there. There we go, it's at that angle there. Right, now again, we're not trying to make the port big. This is a 169cc port, right? So you can see that not much has come off. Oh, and by the way, and I didn't mention this anywhere else, we do need to skinny down the guide boss. So either side of the guide boss is a crucial area. So that is best done with a cutter and finished off with about a 1/2 inch emery roll. Now what I want to demonstrate here is this bowl, part of the bowl here, and this vane. Now when you get these heads, that's the tail of the guide, or the vane, is across at an angle like that, straight in line with the port, right? You need to focus on taking metal off around here and down here so that it's across like this. Now you can't get it across much more than that, there just isn't metal there to do it. It will get smaller, but because you're going deeper here, it will have more effect. On this side here, just a shade off this wall here, but not too much. Now let me talk about some thermal barriers here. If you're going to do any thermal barriering, you need to do it, and this is especially so with a nitrous or a supercharged engine, because there's a lot more exhaust heat. You need to thermal barrier this surface here, which is of course adjacent to here, and there's no water jacket, right? So anyway, there's the intake bowl, right? Nice radius going into the port here from the area ruling that we did, and this one here is slightly tighter. Make sure that the tight part of the radius is close to the seat and that it flares out from there. Same applies to the exhaust. So now let's just look at an exhaust diagram here to see how that looks. Here's a cross section through the exhaust port. Now what I want to show here is this dotted line. That's more like the exhaust port is after the seat's been cut from the bigger insert that goes there. What we're looking for is almost no radius off this tight turn here. All that area ruling you did, and it produced a radius here, just take that radius off and just have a tiny little corner break just there. And this only goes on the short side turn of the valve, and only about a third of it at that. After you've done that, you need to have the tightest part of the radius on the floor close to the seat and have it get bigger and bigger and bigger as it goes down. That will get you the best flow and the least reversion. Okay, let's orientate ourselves here. Roof of the port, floor. There's a lot of flow up here, so a generous radius here, and move the port up as far as possible within the constraints allowed by the gasket. Do not take any more off the bottom than you have to. This is the cylinder wall side of the port, so the flow is going out at an angle like this. So we need to make sure, as I've said before, that we bowl this out here, right, so that the flow goes out and it will actually come across. So this is a high flow corner here, so make sure that this is as wide as possible across there. Apart from that, the guide boss, well, you can see the shape of that, a nice ½ inch, 3/4 inch, or a worn out 3/4 inch emery roll will form that deal there. Right, that should do it for our port description here. Okay, it's flow bench time. I have our test head set up here on the flow bench, and our IOP program to analyze the test results is all set, ready to go on the computer. Well, that's our flow testing over with. Let's take a look at the results. So what have we achieved here? Let's look at this chart here, and what it shows is the available extra through flow area in the supersonic phase of the flow at low lift. So that we had a good comparison, I made sure that the 1.6 valve port was from a good cylinder head. It was from a Cup Car SB2 head that had been ported by a Cup Car guy. It wasn't an area ruled head, but it was a very high flowing cylinder head. Peak flow was about 243 CFM, I think, at about 850 lift. We're lifting our test valve here only to about 700 lift, so we're only going to compare the first 250. Our port flows around about 215 at 700, compared with the Cup Car's port at about 235 at 700. Right, so that's the difference. It's all up at the top end. Anyway, let's get down to it. Here's the area advantage that we have doing the port with an area ruled port with a 1.7 valve. This is our average gain. So you can see for about a 12% increase in valve area, we've actually managed to get about a 14.25% increase in flow. It drops off here because the 1.7 valve gets shrouded quicker than the 1.6, so it drops off here, and ultimately we get about 12.2% improvement in flow up to probably about 400 lift. Just before we get into our flow test chart, I just want to show you the opening screen and the final screen. It's both, but the 302 or 306 engine that I was talking about, the program predicted 404 foot-pounds of torque and 440 horsepower is the limitation, right? In effect, we made like 398 and 431, so it's fairly close there, right? But anyway, now let's go and look at one of these flow test screens. So, observed intake flow, observed exhaust flow, right? So they're already put in, and apart from that, we get, and I've pushed the calculate button, which is down here just off screen, and what it does is it will calculate the final CFM over there, plus the SA discharge coefficient, plus the intake and exhaust ratio, plus the port velocity, which is way over here. The corrected numbers, right? As it happens, they're correct. They were flowed at 28 inches and they're corrected to 28 inches, so they are identical to the observed figures, right? I put 227 into here at just over 700 lift. I don't know, something around about 750-ish. We saw a high of 287. Right, but it's irrelevant because we're not lifting there. We're using a maximum lift of probably around about 600 here. Right, now let's look at our graphs. Okay, a lot of you are probably not used to looking at flow curves, so telling whether it's good or bad is not going to be something you'll do just like that. So what I did here for a comparison is I used a cylinder head of known performance. Here's the lines for it, the thin lines. This cylinder head was a trick flow head that had just been cleaned up, right? Now, I don't mention trick flow heads very often, and I should apologize to Trick Flow for this, but they've got some very functional cylinder heads, and the head represented by those thin lines was no exception. It was just had a cleanup and was dyno tested, and on a 393 inch Ford motor, it cranked out something like 550 horsepower and about 535 foot-pounds of torque, which comes under the heading of really good. So I'm not comparing some has-been head with another. By the way, if you want to check out the mods on this trick flow head, I'm going to be doing a video on it, so watch out for that in the close future. Right, now let's get back to this. As you will see, careful work with seat geometry and ports has resulted in some very good flow curves, both intake and exhaust. But it's not just flow we need to concern ourselves with. One of the most important things we have to look at is port velocity. So let's just take a good quick look at that. I should have told you this beforehand. The magic number for port velocity is to have 300 feet per second at peak valve lift. Now that 300 feet per second pertains to this flow bench program and is not necessarily universal across the boards. Although accepted SAE calculations for mean port velocity produce very similar results as this. So you can see that our port velocity for our supercharger heads were better than our highly functional trick flow heads, right? They hit almost 300 feet per second up here. Now, the exhaust, we can see that the bigger exhaust, although it flows more, the volume of it has gone up quite a bit. So the port velocity on this is slightly less. However, the real key to performance will be how this compares in terms of port energy. The higher the port energy is, the more the gases are inclined to keep going the way they should. i.e. it has anti-reversion potential, and it has better ram filling potential than a port with less energy. So let's look at that. Okay, here we are with the port energy for our supercharger heads. As you can see, the extra flow in the exhaust has made up for the reduced velocity. In other words, it's traded a pretty big increase in flow for a small drop in velocity. And the net result is the two ports are about the same. Now remember, that thin line is for a very functional trick flow head port. On the intake, we've done very well. Our port energy is quite a bit higher than a head of known high functionality. Right, so we've done well there. So that sums up then. What we've got is a cylinder head with a great deal of potential. Well, here we've got a finished cylinder head. It's got the advantage of 40 to 60 horsepower more on your typical 5.0, 331, whatever, over a normally modified cylinder head. And yet, in the case of the Nitrous, it gives away very little in terms of power to a head modified conventionally. I'm talking about maybe 10 horsepower right at the top end. Torque wise, it probably is virtually the same. So that's the deal here. Now you know how to modify, or you know a lot more about how to modify heads for blower and nitrous use. So exactly what can we expect from these specially modified heads? Heads specifically for nitrous or blower use? Well, I don't have any power figures for this set of heads because I'm doing them literally as we film them. But what I can do is relate my experiences. First thing is, my daughter, here she is in a photograph. on her engine, which she tested at Doug Herbert's while his shop was still open here in Charlotte, produced, I think it was 431 horsepower on the engine with about 400 foot-pounds. And this was a true street motor, 10-to-1 compression, vacuum idle, advance on it, vacuum distributor and carburetor. And on pump gas, it made that 431 horsepower, and like I said, about 400 foot-pounds, and it idled at about 580 RPM, so it was not a big cammed motor. And this was intended for her Mustang. She had a Mustang. She was going to drive it on the street and drag race it occasionally until an all-out drag race car was finished. Anyway, she was only 16 at the time she built this engine, which is a few years ago now. And the power figures were, with a 75 horse jet, we went from 431 horsepower to exactly 550 with just a 75 horsepower jet. Now typically the jet we used here would typically give, on a regular small block Ford with regular modified heads and that, somewhere around about 80-85 horsepower. With the same amount of nitrous flow, we achieved some quick 65 horsepower more, right? Almost doubled the increase shown. Incidentally, if you work out the percentages here, the increase in output was actually a little bigger than the increase in flow potential that we offered the cylinder heads on this, but that may have been just due to a few other things as well. Trouble with testing nitrous is it's terribly unrepeatable. Anyway, let's go to the next step here. Supercharger applications. I've got one in mind here that will be very interesting. Many years ago, and I think it was probably around either the late 80s or early 90s, I did a small block Chevy head for a company, and for the life of me I can't remember it. There was a supercharger manufacturing company, and Hot Rod was doing a story on the build they were doing. And I did a set of Brodex heads for them with 1.8 exhaust valves and 1.94 intake, I think it was. Now, the dyno operator said that typically on a spec of 350 like they were doing, they would see about 13 horsepower increase for every pound of boost. This was on engines where the boost was limited to about 15 pounds. Well, the heads that I did for them, they got 15.5 horsepower per pound of boost. So they went from 195 horsepower increase to something like 235 horsepower increase. So what's that? A 40 horsepower extra output. Now here's the thing. The cylinder pressures probably didn't change. So that extra power, as with the nitrous, came without the associated stress of having to have more boost or more nitrous to make the same power. So these heads actually help enhance the reliability for any given output. And one last thing, and I haven't mentioned this before. If outright horsepower is not the goal, but you'd like to see some economy, then it is a good idea to increase the size of the exhaust valve as much as possible and to use a cam with the appropriate short timing. I've done this with small block Chevys way back when, and I've actually managed to get to 25 to the gallon with a carbureted one on the freeway, and that's with a motor that's making 475 to 490 horsepower. So this area ruling of the exhaust and changing the balance of the valves can be very beneficial. Let me conclude by saying, if you like this video and you want to learn more about cylinder heads and building race engines in general, then you should go and check out David Vizard performance seminars, right? The website will go across top or the bottom, whichever. And if you like videos like this and you want to see more, please subscribe and hit the like button as well. Thank you.